A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at this GCF's event on supporting developing countries' aspirations and ambitions for energy transition. As you know, if we have to keep the world safe, if we have to meet the targets of climate-safe world, energy transition within this decade needs to have a significant progress. Estimates indicate emissions have to reduce by half in this decade. The world needs a lot more financing than is being mobilized currently for that to happen, especially for those countries that are still in the development trajectory, and the trajectory needs to bend towards a carbon-free or low-carbon, climate-resilient energy system. How can we collectively support that in that ambition and in that aspiration is what today's session will discuss, and the role GCF can play in that. Good afternoon again. My name is Kavita Sinha. I'm the Deputy Director for Mitigation and Adaptation in the GCF, and I will moderate the discussion today. Before I begin, some housekeeping rules. Since we are still in a COVID situation, I request everyone in the audience to please keep your masks on and maintain social distancing throughout this session. I'll also note that this session, like all the sessions that GCF is hosting, is being live streamed today. So a warm welcome to all the online guests who are joining us. A quick run-off show before I turn it over to the discussion today. We will begin with a government session, but first, before that, Yannick Gremerick, our Executive Director from GCF, he will provide some opening remarks, followed by a baseline presentation, which will set the tone for the discussion from Mary Warlick, the Deputy Executive Director of International Energy Agency. She'll provide the magnitude of problem and the baseline of how much gap there is in financing. For then, our government panelists here, esteemed panelists from the government, to then discuss and provide their reflections on what their aspirations and ambitions are and the expectations from GCF. On the panel here today is Mrs. Claudia Dobles Camargo, First Lady of Costa Rica, and also a very renowned architect and urban planner. We're glad to have you here, ma'am. Thank you for joining us. We also have Mr. Ram Gopal Kharbuja, Joint Secretary, Ministry of Energy, Water and Irrigation from Nepal. We also have Dr. Marlady, the Head of Policy from the Government of Botswana. Thank you so much for joining. Without further ado, I would now like to request Yannick Gremerick, our Executive Director, for his opening remarks to set the stage for why GCF considers energy transition an important thing.
Thank you very much, Kavita. Dear participant, in person of virtual, it's really great to welcome you to the joint GCF pavilion for a critical discussion. In 2021, GCF has allocated 10.4, basically in 2021, GCF has approved a record number of projects for the energy transition. It's in total, it's for about $10.4 billion with $1.3 billion of GCF co-financing. With this record approval, now our energy portfolio accounts for 28% of our total portfolio. Our building cities portfolio for 15%, and we are starting to build our transport portfolio 5%, notably with the light rail projects in Costa Rica. So why did we invest so much in 2021 in the energy transition? One of the reasons is, as I had the opportunity to mention it this morning, Kevin, during the African Development Bank's event on Desert to Power, it's because we are not to avert catastrophic climate change if we do not decarbonize the power sector. It's priority number one. So you have a number of estimates from 70% to 100% of electricity having to come from renewable energy technologies by 2050. There is also another reason. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought us to a tipping point or a turning point. If the trillions of economic stimulus measures basically finance green, climate resilient recovery, we could actually achieve the Paris Agreement goal. On the other hand, if we have exactly the same type of recoveries that we had in 2009, which was basically a high carbon, climate vulnerable recovery, we will lose any kind of opportunity to meet the Paris Agreement goal. We will cross the 2 degrees Celsius around 2050. And so it's an existential issue for humankind, whether or not we are to successfully green the economic stimulus measures put in place to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And right now we are not doing it. According to UNEP, less than 20% of the total recovery measures are green. According to Vivid Economics, it's less than 10% of the measures that are green. So for GCF, it was critical to ensure that we could immediately support projects that will encourage investment in green, climate resilient initiatives. What are the main type of activities we support when we decide to invest in an energy project? The first thing we can do is that we can support in developing a conducive policy environment. For example, a conducive policy environment can mean integrated policies that integrate water management, energy management, land management, city development, coastal development. We believe that in some cases we could reduce the total investment requirement by up to 40% through promoting integrated policies. We know also that countries with a complete policy framework to encourage investment in clean energy can attract up to 7 times more investment than countries that have an incomplete policy framework. So that's the first thing that we do. The second thing is that we try to promote innovations. We will have to promote innovation in the south as much as in the north. The days where we were speaking about technology transfer from the north to the south are over. If you look at one of the most successful innovation in terms of energy access was the pay-as-you-go model enabled by mobile, with, for example, M-Kopa in Kenya. This kind of innovation gives us a fighting chance to provide energy access to the 700 million people who do not have access to electricity, and to the more than 2 billion people who do not have access to the improved cooking device. This innovation are not to come from the north. They will come from the south. There is no market for improved cooking devices in the north. And therefore, we need to foster innovation in the south. We need to make sure that climate innovators in the south have access to technical assistance to refine their business model, have access to early growth finance. And the GCF can support incubators and accelerators, can support different type of specialty finance for early growth finance. And for example, we were very pleased to work with Kawasaki, with Acumen, to provide equity to small and medium enterprises involved in decentralized energy access. In 2018, 2019, we were providing them equity to develop their business. In 2021, we will provide them equity to make sure that the liquidity problems that they are facing because of COVID-19 does not become a solvency problem. The third type of things that we do, and those we are the most well known for, is that we are certainly one of the largest sources of blended finance today. What we do is that we blend our resources with the resources of our public investors or private investors to de-risk the project. It's when you come with a new climate solution, a new technology, a new business model, it's inherently de-risky. It's inherently risky because you do not have any kind of track record, and you can very quickly end up in cost overrun, because suddenly you discover that there is one policy gap that makes it impossible for you to commission your project, or you suddenly discover that your technology does not work as you thought, and you have to recalibrate it. So this kind of market-creating projects, these projects that we create a commercial track record, are risky. And what we do is that we use the fact that we are capital agnostic We are financing grant, but we can provide any kind of non-grant or non-grant instrument, be an extension of the tenure of a loan or guarantees or equities to reduce the level of risk for those who are willing to bring to scale, to commercial scale, a new climate solution. And I will give a few examples. You tell me when I've spoken too much. And the fourth type of things that we do to support electricity access is that we try to enhance the capacity of domestic financial institution, public or private institution, because at the end of the day, finance is parochial and will always remain parochial. You invest in the people you know, you invest in the technology you know, you invest in the geographies you know. And so it's extremely important to strengthen the capacity of domestic, public and private institutions, the public development bank, commercial banks, to be able to originate climate investment. Once we have a commercial track record, to have a look at it and say, okay, I can also originate this kind of projects, and to be able to access domestic or international capital markets to finance them, such as issuing, for example, green bonds. So that's the range of interventions that we can support. And now, if I still have a little bit of time, Kavita.
Take a minute, go ahead.
I will give a couple of examples. So one was the project launched by the African Development Bank this morning by President Akinwumi Adesina, where it's a wonderful project, basically, that will invest in the optimization of the grid in the G5 countries of the Sahel, and will foster private investment in terms of power production. And we were very pleased to be able to contribute $150 million to what is almost $1 billion activity. Another example that I would like maybe to take is the ASEAN Green Catalytic Fund that was launched here before yesterday. And this one, the idea was to put in place a platform that will enable investors to basically meet the higher upfront cost of climate investment. Climate investment have higher upfront cost, higher capex, lower opex. And so there, we created a syndicate with the Asian Development Bank, GCF, the Asian Development Bank, the British government, the European Union, and it's almost close to $2 billion that have been of public money put together in order to catalyze a minimum of $7 billion of private investment. And there, the projects basically enable investors, private investors, to go over the hurdle of the higher capex. Can I take a last project?
Go ahead.
And a last project, and I think for me this one is also extremely important, is the cooling facility. There we have right now 3.6 billion cooling appliances in the world. By 2050, we will have 14 billion cooling appliances. Cooling will be a human right, will not be a luxury. Either you have a cooling appliance or your life is at risk during a heat wave event. Now, if this additional $10 billion of cooling appliances are not energy efficient, the game is over. And it's like missing a green climate resilient recovery. It's another tipping point. And this project is to ensure that we come with a number of policy instruments that will encourage individual consumers to purchase energy efficient cooling device, from reducing the cost of energy efficient devices to providing information to consumers through standards and label, to coming with a number of pre-financing mechanisms. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yannick. Thank you for laying out the magnitude of the problem that we are trying to solve with GCF funding, and that can only be done through use of the resources catalytically. We will now have a keynote presentation by Mary Warlick, Ambassador Mary Warlick, the Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. She's joining us online to give a brief presentation. Can we have her presentation, please?
It's a great pleasure to be joining you all remotely for this really important discussion today on climate finance. Supporting and accelerating the global energy transition is so important, and this is such a critical piece of it. And congratulations on everything that you are doing through the Green Climate Fund to accelerate and support this process. At the International Energy Agency, we truly believe that fostering the financial conditions for a rapid deployment of clean energy in emerging and developing economies is one of the defining challenges of our times. In our Financing Clean Energy Transitions in Emerging and Developing Economies report earlier this year, we show that while per capita emissions in emerging and developing economies are relatively low, these areas are where nearly all future growth in global emissions will come from. The group of countries outside of China account for 2/3 of the world's population, but they only represent 1/5 of global investment in clean energy. Countries and societies are not starting the race to net zero from the same place, and no one wins this race unless everyone finishes. This is why the transition must be fair and inclusive, leaving nobody behind. And we actually lost ground on some of these aspects during the pandemic. Progress on energy access, for instance, has slowed down, and more people now lack access to clean cooking compared to 2019. The COVID-19 crisis has sapped the ability of households and consumers to pay for energy services and has worsened the financial situation of many utility companies, rural electrification companies, and other businesses that are working hard to improve access to electricity and clean cooking. And our analysis shows that fully achieving all net zero pledges to date and the global methane pledge this week by those who signed it would limit global warming to 1.8 degrees Celsius. But as we show in our World Energy Outlook, these commitments, if implemented in full, only address 20% of the gap in emissions reductions that need to be closed by 2030 to keep the door open to reach net zero by 2050. And there is a risk that this delayed near-term action will put the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario out of reach, leaving us with too much to do after 2030, with too high of a level of locked-in emissions and with too little progress in innovation in clean energy technologies. The good news is that we have the policies and technologies to close this ambition gap, and a substantial share of the necessary emissions reductions come from cost-effective and well-understood technology measures. So with the right enabling conditions, over 40% of this ambition gap could be closed with cost-effective technology measures. And staying on track with 1.5 degrees Celsius also involves shifting to a completely new energy economy, with a surge in annual investment in clean energy to around 4 trillion by 2030, up from less than 1 trillion today. And most of this growth comes from the emerging and developing economies, where there needs to be a dramatic scale up of private capital to fund 60% of clean investments by 2030. We need a major reallocation in financial flows to two areas that are underserved today: to clean energy in general, and to emerging and developing economies in particular. At the IEA, we've identified several actions to close this finance and investment gap. First, there is no shortage of private capital worldwide, but is simply not finding its way to where it is most needed. Sustainable debt issuances has reached record levels. The same surge in capital expenditures in clean energy projects on the ground has not yet been observed. Then, in a more capital-intensive clean energy system, bringing down the cost of capital is critical. One of the defining features of energy transitions is the shift towards technologies with higher upfront capital, but lower operating costs. Wind turbines, solar panels, and electric cars are all good examples. However, when we look at the availability and cost of capital today, we see a problem. Developing and emerging economies face capital costs up to 7 times higher than in the United States or Europe. And in addition, many countries do not yet have a clear vision or the supportive policy and regulatory environments that can drive rapid energy transitions. Project-specific factors are often compounded by broader cross-cutting issues, which undermine risk-adjusted returns for investors and the availability of bankable projects. So the international community must up its game to ensure all countries have access to the finance they need to bring modern energy technologies and new economic opportunities to their citizens. And meeting net zero goals will depend on reinforcing public commitments, boosting delivery, and improving effectiveness of public sources to mobilize higher amounts of private investment. An international catalyst is needed to boost clean energy investment. This starts with the commitment by advanced economies to mobilize 100 billion or more annually in international climate finance. And it's a necessary commitment, but it will not be sufficient to close the gap toward reaching net zero targets, and it will not mobilize enough private capital. Governments need to continue to reinforce the mandate of international public finance institutions like the GCF to support clean energy investment and boost and improve the delivery of funds. If used well, blended climate finance, which was mentioned by Yannick as well, can also catalyze private investment in areas not moving fast enough by improving risk profiles of some market-ready investments and supporting small-scale projects that lack a track record with banks. Risk capital is also important in sectors at early stages of readiness and in cases where risks are hard to mitigate, such as energy access projects. International stakeholders and emerging and developing economies also need to help governments address the cross-cutting and sector-specific actions that help to get investments moving on the ground. And this includes actions to make it easier to prepare clean energy projects, get energy price signals and carbon markets right, and put state-owned utilities on firmer financial footing. And it also means putting in place policies that support investable projects across clean power, efficiency and electrification, as well as transitions for fuels and emissions-intensive sectors, such as reforms to support development of renewables project pipelines with the right risk-return balance and reduce cost of capital. Accelerating emissions reductions from existing unabated coal assets is a crucial component of climate action, but a much trickier challenge for public policy. So a multi-pronged effort will also be needed to manage the financial and human consequences of phasing out emissions-intensive assets. Mobilizing the huge wealth in global capital markets is critical to funding clean energy transitions, and the role of the private sector as a provider of a climate finance is called to grow. But as emerging and developing economies are approaching energy transitions with different conditions and thus different speeds, the alignment of investment portfolios with net zero emissions goals risks excluding countries with higher carbon footprints or sectors with more challenging transition pathways. International sustainable finance efforts focus on ways to incentivize investors to fund a broader range of clean energy investment opportunities, especially in emerging and developing economies. The silver lining is that energy transition can bring major new economic opportunities, notably through the creation of new jobs associated with clean energy investments and activities. For instance, we estimate that almost 30 million new clean energy jobs are created in the net zero scenario.
May we request you to start wrapping up, please?
Far higher than the jobs that are lost in declining sectors. The task ahead is urgent and essential. Strong international collaboration and deep engagement with policymakers and private investors at the national level are required to enable ambitious strategies for attracting and efficiently deploying international climate finance. So I encourage colleagues to make the most use of the COP26 forum to connect and build country partnerships and create or engage in knowledge exchange platforms to facilitate cross-border investments.
Thank you, Ms.
Drawing
Wallach.
upon successful examples around the world, the IEA will continue to provide its world-class data analysis and policy advice to support governments and the private sector in mobilizing private capital for clean energy transitions in emerging markets and developing economies, notably with the publication of our Sub-Sahara Africa outlook.
Ms. Warlick,
next year.
thank you very much for your interventions. Thank you so much. Thank you for Ambassador Warlick's comments there. She laid the foundation for what needs to be done. IEA has been doing a major job in making sure the data that we have is the same baseline we all are working towards. With that, I will have the pleasure now and the honor of inviting for special address and reflections, first from our government panelists here, starting with Mrs. Claudia Dobles Camargo, the First Lady of Costa Rica. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the GCF for hosting this event in such an important topic. Also, I would like to thank you because you are a key partner in accelerating this process for most of our economies. In emerging or developing economies, there is a huge range of diversification, but I think that we hold some common challenges. The first is that we are pretty much minor emissions. We are pretty much in the least percentage of, we generate the minor percentage of emissions. But at the same time, we are probably one of the most vulnerable countries in facing climate crisis. How do we have to address these topics? I strongly believe that we have to address several issues at the same time, which is quite a challenge. We need to address society and our culture from our different countries. At the same time, creating trust on how can we transition to a different technologies that in some countries they are completely new, they represent some risk or the perception of risk in our communities. And how can we incorporate our communities in the process of policy making, which is the framework in order to do the transition. Mostly, we need financial tools to do the transition. In understanding financial tools, I believe that we have to have an honest, adult, and serious conversation about what is risk capital. And the truth is that facing climate crisis, we need to understand that the most important threat to our economies is climate crisis. It provides huge impacts in our economies. So we need to start rethinking risk. That is something very important, and I think for our countries is very important. Second, we need sometimes, and some countries will need, technical cooperation in order to provide, based on the policy making, in order to provide planning, planning, energy routes, or implementing investment planning, so we can really provide strong projects in order to have good financing tools for those processes and those projects. So technical cooperation, I believe that it will be also important. In some cases, non-reimbursable financing tools will be also important. In the case of Costa Rica, which I am very proud to say as Costa Rican, we lived this process with a bittersweet irony. The thing is that we have an electricity matrix that is basically based on renewables. We have 99% of our electricity matrix is based on renewables. Our main source for Costa Rican electricity is water. Then we have geothermal. Then we have wind. And last but not least, we have biomass and we have solar. And Costa Rica is developing green hydrogen. So I think we have the whole range of renewables just in one small country. But the irony resides that our energy matrix is still based on fossil fuels, in our case, mostly because of our transportation sector. So our decarbonization plan, and I strongly encourage that this roadmap, it's going to be completely different in each country because of its own context, its own challenges. In our case, the transportation sector is a key sector to address if we really want to achieve our decarbonization goals. So we have started with several different actions. We have provided for those actions and those projects preparation and planning. So I think this is key for the whole process. And in our case, we have achieved great success and advance in all those processes. Basically, how to incorporate electrification in the transport sector, both private and public, having the electrical train for the greater metropolitan area as the backbone of a new transportation system, to create the legal framework, the regulatory framework, then planification and financing tools.
Thank you so very much for having this whole vision for decarbonization, not just in the power sector, but also transport, which is the second largest contributor in the world to the emissions. Thank you for your remarks. We will now follow with hearing from the perspectives from Nepal of the challenges in energy transition and what that means today for Nepal's context, especially one of the largest population of people without access to clean cooking are in Nepal. Mr. Ram Gopal Kharbuja.
Thanks, first of all, providing me this opportunity to organizers for developing countries' aspirations and ambitions of energy transmission expressions. I am extremely delighted to share our perspective on financing needs and challenges for energy transitions. In this regard, I would like to highlight our baselines and ambitions as set out in the second National Determined Contributions, which has been already submitted in 2020 to UNFCCC, that showcase our financing needs and the challenges for energy transition. In terms of electricity generation, Nepal relies heavily on hydropower for its electricity generation, which is clean and renewable energy source with no carbon dioxide emissions, where the demands are covered primarily by runoff the rivers and peaking ROR projects. Currently, it has installed capacity of around 1900 megawatt, of which more than 95% of its hydroelectricity. The second NDC aims to be 2030 expands the clean energy generation up to 15,000 megawatt, of which 5 to 10% will be generated from mini and micro hydropower projects, and solar, wind, and bioenergy. Of this, 5,000 megawatt is an unconditional target, and the remainder is dependent upon the provision of funding by the international community. In terms of transportation and residential cooking, currently around 5% of households use the electric induction stoves either as their primary or secondary mode of cooking. In residential cooking, access to clean energy cooking solutions remains critical as the rural people use high-intensive traditional sources of fuels like firewood, animal waste, and the crop residue for cooking purpose. The second NDC aims as follows. By 2030, ensure 25% of the households use the electric stoves as their primary mode of cooking. By 2025, install an additional 200,000 households biogas plants and 500 large-scale biogas plants especially for institutional like industrial, municipals, and communities. In terms of transportation, the current share of electricity vehicles is approximately just 1% of the 1%. The second NDC has set for the following targets. By 2025, the sales of electricity vehicles will be 25% of all private passengers vehicles sales, including two-wheeler, and 20% of all four-wheeler public passenger vehicle sales. By 2030, increase sale of e-vehicles to cover 90% of all private passengers vehicle sales, including two-wheeler, and 60% of all four-wheelers public passenger vehicle sales. By 2030, develop a 200 kilometer of electric rail networks to support public commuting and mass transportation of the goods. Finally, the second NDC states that the cost of achieving Nepal NDC conditional mitigation target is estimated to be $25 billion. The cost of the achieving unconditional target outlined in the NDC is estimated to be $3.4 billion. This estimate only covers activities based on the targets and does not include the cost of policies, measures, and the actions. To achieve the conditional targets, Nepal anticipates financial, technological, and capacity building support from bilateral, multilateral agencies, development partners, and global funds such as the Green Climate Fund, Global Environment Facilities, Adaptation Fund, and the LDC Fund. Government of Nepal is committed to meeting the targets outlined in the NDC, and we look forward to partnership with the collaboration with valued international partners to boost limited national resources and capacities for scaling up of the climate actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karbuja, for having an ambitious NDC, and that's what we are about here, talking about aspirations and ambitions. I now finally call upon Dr. Marlady Maswavi, the head of policy for Ministry of Energy in Botswana.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying Botswana is also vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, like most of the countries. And because of that, our government is very, very much committed to joining the global world in combating the challenges of climate change. And this can be seen by most of our actions so far. For instance, we were amongst the very first countries to submit our INDC well before Paris. And at the moment, we are working on reviewing the INDC to make it even more ambitious. And our analysis have shown that the energy sector is the most contributing sector to our emissions in the country. And based on that, you will see that most of our mitigation actions are geared towards energy transition, transforming the existing energy system to ensure that we gradually transition from relying on coal for energy as the main resource to gradually increasing the share of renewable energies into our energy mix, and also trying to improve the existing energy system. As it is now, Botswana has got abundant solar. We have a lot of solar that we are looking at exploring and improving our system. And as it is now, one may ask, how do we intend on doing that? We have set up some targets. We've set ourselves some targets. We have a 15% target for solar energy or renewable energy contribution by the year 2030. We are also looking at improving energy efficiency by at least 18% by the year 2030. We also have an ambition of reaching universal access, energy access by 2030. And one may ask, how are we going to achieve all that? This is where the financing aspect comes in. We do have a renewable energy roadmap in place. We also have an integrated resource plan, which was launched by the Minister of Energy last year in December 2020. And in the IRP, we've got a series of renewable energy projects. The IRP is a 20-year long term, so it is actually outlining the power build program for our country between the year 2020 and 2040. And within there, we have solar PV of about 135 megawatts to be put into the system by 2022. And this is a project that is currently under, we're starting working on it. And we also have plans to put up solar CSP. We have plans for wind. We have plans for coal bed methane in the IRP. And the country's vision is placing focus on facilitating private public partnerships and investment in clean energy. And the IRP projects in our plans will be private sector led. So in order to attain that, as a government, we ought to find a way of overcoming existing barriers that are preventing our renewable energy deployment and also preventing the mobilization of private investment. And this is where the SRMI comes in. The SRMI The Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative facility recognizes the importance of private sector investment in solar energy deployment, as well as off-grid solar to expand energy access. And it also acknowledges that various governments have got an important role in playing in unlocking private investment in solar. And as it is, Botswana has applied for and we have been granted funding under the SRMI by the GCF. I'm happy to say that. And
Thank you. Thank you so much for your remarks and acknowledging GCF's role.
Yes, and with that funding that we got from GCF, we are looking at improving our energy transition pathway in funding three aspects. The first one will be technical assistance, where we're looking at upstream and downstream. The funding will help us in designing and implementing a sustainable renewable energy program, and also to operationalize it through bankable projects that will be procured competitively. We're also looking at, secondly, public sector investments for critical investments, such as our grid upgrades, coming up with solar or wind parks.
Thank you, Dr. Marlady.
Okay.
Thank you. We will, sorry if you could just wrap up, please, now.
Okay, yeah. And I was just going to get to the last one, like coming up with tailored risk mitigation instruments to mitigate critical residual risks that cannot be covered through the upfront de-risking. And in conclusion, I just want to say that concessional finance from GCF, coupled with World Bank, of course, will play a very key role in supporting our sustainable development pathways, in particular our energy transition, especially now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where our country resources are now redirected towards other emergency responses and other prioritized sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. With that, we come to the end of the government perspective section. Please join me in giving them a warm big Thank you, speakers. I know, Yannick, you have to leave, so we'll be stepping down. May I request the government speakers to step down, and we will invite our international partners to please join me on the stage here. We heard the challenges from the developing countries' perspective. We will now hear what GCF's partners are doing to address that. We have an impressive list of partners who have worked with us, partnered with us this year from the public sector side as well as on the private sector side to bring about funding and catalyzing and mobilizing private sector capital in this very important area. We have Mr. Ricardo Politi, Vice President Infrastructure of the World Bank. He will give us remarks first. We have followed by Dr. Kevin Karaoke, the Vice President of Afdb, followed by Mr. Abdul Majid Nasleka, Group CEO and CRDB Managing Director, followed by Miguel Mendes of CABE, the Head of Partnerships and Internationals at CABE, and then finally, last but not least, Mr. Joram Skovren, Director of FMO. Sorry, I mangled your name. With that, Mr. Ricardo Politi, please.
Just to say, very happy to be here. I've been requested a little bit to talk about how we work with GCF and how happy we are. So I can tell you we're very happy. However, I would like to say it is really the moment where all kind of finance must come on deck and work together. So it is not only public, it's not only private, but it is public, private, philanthropic, development, all kind of financing, because the scale of the problem is quite big. And in even a large institution like the World Bank, I can assure you, it's pretty small vis-à-vis all what we have to do. I have to say, what I heard earlier is absolutely correct. We need money, we need financing for many things, for project selection, for project preparation, because it's not easy to prepare a project. We need money for blended financing in order to make sure that the overall cost of financing is affordable for the countries and communities where we work. We need money in order to de-risk projects, and then I will go 1 second on the SRMI facilities. So in the reality, I have to say I'm very pleased when I'm here at COP26 to see finally that there is an acknowledgement that there is a lot of funding of all kind, I repeat, public, private, philanthropic, whatever, that must be put together in order to accelerate energy transition. Now, in our case, with we work with all the partners here. I mean, for me, many of the names, I mean, FMO, African Development Bank, I mean, these are household names. I have to say, working with the GCF, we have a great tradition, and we are very, very grateful of working together. Maybe Yannick could have been a little bit shorter in his speech, but having said that, we have two big facilities together. We have the cooling facility. So, guys, we have to think about this. If the temperature of the globe will go above 1.5 degrees, and by 2030 there will be 2.3 billion people that will be vulnerable to heat waves. I know it sounds incredible now, but 10 years ago, what we see last summer in Germany with these huge storms and death and all the rest, we would have thought, well, come on, don't be exaggerating. We are not exaggerating anymore, I'm afraid. So cooling is very important, very, very, very important indeed. So together with the GCF, we created the first cooling facility where the GCF has contributed 157 million. We contributed 700 million, and we are already making operational with operations in El Salvador or in Somalia, just to give an example. It is also true that it's the moment where finance is great, but if you don't use the finance, I mean, it leaves a little bit what it is. We cannot stop at declarations. Then the other thing that we've done recently with the GCF, actually in October, and I think it's great, and Madam, you were so kind to mention it, the Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative, which actually started together with the International Solar Alliance, with the government of France, the government of India, and the government of the United Kingdom. And I think it's a great facility in order to de-risk the projects, because it's not only an issue of new technology and technological risk. I wouldn't say that the problem. The problem is really the perception of investing in developing countries. The fact that I come from a banking background, that if you were to go to a credit committee with some countries in the world, they wouldn't listen to you. They would say, come on, too much risk and all the rest. So I have to say, we have to de-risk the countries, the sovereign risk, the sub-sovereign risk, the project risk, the effects, the conversion risk, convertibility risk. We have to take them out if we want to do that. So we co-invested together with the GCF on the Sustainable Renewables Risk Mitigation Initiative. The name is so long that every time I have to look at it here. But anyway, it's a great facility. The GCF put 280 million. We put 1.2 billion with the idea to unlock 2.5 gigawatts of solar and wind in 7 countries, including, by the way, Botswana and Namibia. So the idea is also to leverage. You will find a lot of these words here at COP26, to leverage, to mobilize. So the idea is to leverage funding from private companies at the level of more or less 3.5 billion. And I think this is what public institutions should do. They should take more risks to mobilize more private funding. So I have to say these are just 2 examples, and we are very, very happy to work together and with all of you colleagues. I hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Politi. I'm seeming like a police here trying to control the time, but when you have so many important bankers controlling financial strings sitting together, you can't waste time. Thank you very much for your remarks. I'll now call on Dr. Kevin Karaoke, Vice President of AFDB, another very important partner for GCF, to provide your remarks and how we work together on energy transition this year.
Thank you very much. I think in order to contextualize this problem correctly, I'll wish to provide some bit of statistics. Today, in Africa, 600 million people lack access to electricity, which is 75% of the global population without access to electricity. In addition, we also have 900 million people lacking access to clean cooking. And in this regard, we also know that 6% of the, despite being home to 20% of the global population, only 6% of the global energy demand comes from Africa, and a little over 3%. Why am I saying this? This is despite the fact that Africa has some of the best solar insolation. In Africa has a solar potential of about 10 terawatts, of which less than 1% has been harnessed. And this is why the African Development Bank started or initiated what we call the Desert to Power project, starting from Senegal in the west all the way to Ethiopia in the east. We intend to develop 10,000 megawatts of solar, creating the world's largest solar zone. And here, the idea here is we've all heard that capital is not the challenge. There is money. There's philanthropic money, there's DFI money, there's climate financing money. But the challenge here is that in order to be able to develop these projects, we need concessional resources, such as those provided by GCF, which, as Ricardo mentioned, are catalytic, and they enable to attract additional funding. For example, as far as the project we have with GCF, the Desert Power, is concerned, the $150 million that we are getting from GCF will help us attract private sector investment amounting to about $430 million, which, in addition to $380 million from the bank as co-financing, will result in projects that yield affordable tariffs, and therefore facilitating electricity access to the people in the Sahel region. This particular funding is with respect to 5 countries, mainly what we call the G5 Sahel, which are number 1, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, and yeah. There's a 5th one. Yeah, there are 5 initial countries. So with these countries, this power will basically provide and facilitate increased access to electricity in these particular areas. There's also a very interesting thing. Apart from providing electricity access, there are also very important aspects of this project. This project will also result in reductions in emissions of 14.4 million tons equivalent of CO2, which is huge, and benefit 3.5 million people. So this is one area where we are working with GCF, and as I said, we expect overall to provide power to 250 million people overall in the bigger project, but this will include 90 million people through off-grid systems. And just to mention that it is expected by 2030 that at least 50% of all new connections will be through what you call distributed renewable energy systems, which brings me to another very transformative project that we are working with GCF. And this is what we call the Leveraging Energy Access Finance Framework, through which we were very privileged to obtain a financing of $171 million from GCF. This is for me, is also one of what I would call a game changer. Because this funding of 171 million is part of an overall financing of 900 million. Talk of what Ricardo talked about, leveraging. And the idea here is to scale up the deployment of mini-grids, solar home systems, and captive power in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This project is aimed at unlocking local currency finance and support the growth of decentralized and distributed renewable energy businesses, offering solar home systems, green mini-grids, and captive commercial and industrial solutions. There is a third project, but I don't know whether I have time for that. I mean, I see the way you're looking at me. I don't know what I just mentioned, but I'll do it very briefly. But also, we are also receiving $21 million for what we call the DRC Green Mini-Grid Program. And this project is hugely transformative. For those who know DRC, it's one of the countries that has the lowest energy access globally, despite being home to the largest one of the largest hydropower projects. On the east, where there's absolutely no power, thanks to the funding from GCF, we are starting a project that will entail connection of 500,000 people in 3 large mini-grid systems, which is very unique because this will be the first mini-grids, large-scale mini-grids, that entail the development of projects using what we call structured project finance. This project is already almost rolling out. I think it was launched, I think, a few months ago, 2 months ago. So these are the 3 real projects in which we are working with GCF to contribute to reducing or increasing energy access in Africa. And as I said, if there is one place where you can be able to move the dial in reducing or promoting energy access, universal access globally, that has to be Africa, because, as I said, 75% of Africa, of the people without access to electricity globally, reside in Africa. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Kavita.
Thank you, Kevin. And as Mrs. Dobles Camargo mentioned earlier, that you can't have energy transition unless everybody transitions. So that's a very good point you brought forward. DRC example was well made on that. Thank you for that. We'll now move forward with Mr. Abdul Majid Nsleka, the Group CEO and CRDB Managing Director from Tanzania. We don't have an energy project this year, but I understand that you're looking forward to designing some transformative energy transition projects. Can you talk about that?
Thank you very much, and I must appreciate for giving me opportunity to join this group. And I was actually listening to my colleagues, looking to myself coming from the commercial banks. And I think the biggest question has been always that, is commercial bank ready to finance the transition for energy? I think when you look in terms of Africa, I think the opportunity in terms of energy is big. And most of the countries in Africa, they talk about industrializations and urbanizations. And there was a bigger question about the case of Tanzania. If you look in Tanzania, and in terms of ambitions, where we are today, currently we have about 650 megawatts. The ambition by 2025, we're talking about 5,000. By 2030, we're talking about 10,000 megawatts. And that basically requires a big stride to the government in terms of ambition, but it needs support. When you look in terms of commercial banks and in terms of their balance sheet structure, I will not compare myself with my colleagues here. These kind of projects are talking about long-term financing, and they are pure infrastructure. And most of the balance sheets of the commercial banks are mismatched in terms of liquidity, most in short-term, financially long-term. And that's where we have to appreciate GCF and CRDB being accredited. I think I would say that we are more than ready. In Tanzania, so far, we have about 4 projects coming up. One is for solar, wind, and the blue economy. And that will be aligned to the GCF, looking forward for next year for approval. But nevertheless, it's not about commercial bank being ready. Banks are looking more of commercial-oriented projects. This project, these transitions, they have about social impact. Profit should never be the motive. It's about economic development. And that means we need to have a different thinking about our policy designs, but most banks need to change about their institutional structure. And you need to have sustainable financing in the policy to promote these kind of projects. But developing countries, they also have challenges, especially in the policy perspective. And I was listening to Yanak when he was talking about the level of financing they have put aside, $10.4 billion in the energy. And the biggest question I had was, how much has been accessed by commercial banks? And possibly maybe 10%, and the majority might be on development bank. So what have we done as CLDB? First of all, we have defined our policy toward green funding to promote the climate change initiative. But we're working very closely with the government to review the policy that support the operations of commercial bank. Because most of the commercial bank, they are different in nature in terms of project perspective, and the project structure are different in short term. But this kind of project cannot be regulated based on the normal lending. And I believe that that should promote more the energy in the transition project. The most important part I was speaking in Tanzania, when you speak about power generation, power transmissions, distributions to the end, there is always a different need in each stages. You might be good in generations, but the infrastructure is poor. So how do we finance those kind of projects to ensure that transmission and distributions to the end is affordable, but it always addresses carbon emissions? And that has been the biggest challenge in most of the developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Naskela. You brought a very good point about the need for the value chain of financing to move forward. Thank you, Ricardo, for sparing time. The value chain of the financial system. And that brings us to two more interesting speakers here who are now about the different aspects of the energy value chain, moving on from energy generation to equity investments in company and also to transport. I'll go with Miguel first, and we'll end with you because we have a ceremony with you at the end. So that would be a logical conclusion. So the best thing waits for the last. Miguel, to you about the role of energy transition and the transport project. If you could reflect on that the next 2-3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this panel. And as Kabe's mission is to contribute to the balanced social and economic development of its member countries in Central America, we are really focused on trying to channel resources in order to address the challenges that the countries face. As Mrs. Dobles said at the beginning, our region is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change. And in that regard, in 2016, our board commit to support the countries, our country members, to address these climate change challenges. And how? Doing what we do. So channeling resources to support in the financing of these projects. And in that regard, since then, we already achieved, we got some achievement. For instance, now we increase our portfolio of climate change projects to up to 41% and is increasing. More additionally, trying to channel resources from other sources of money, we already were very active in the relationship with GCF, and so far we already got approved 4 projects for a total amount of $525 million US. And one of these projects is the light rail train, passenger trains in Costa Rica, which is an electric train which will cover 85 kilometers in the main city and around. And indeed, this is a flagship project for us and also for the region because of many aspects. One of them is because of the impact. So the train will have impact in terms of GHG emissions, which is very high, more than 8 billion tons of CO2 emissions avoid, and also at the social level will impact or will support the transportation system for 2.7 million people. So this is a big thing. The other thing which is very important, and I need to check not to make, is that this project is possible not only for the collaboration of the public sector, but also is a contribution with the private sector. So this is a PPP. And indeed, the total amount of the project is 1.9 billion US dollars. And from this, the public sector will contribute with 550 millions, and the other will be 1.3 billions will be leveraged from private sector. Additionally, this project is very important because of the inclusiveness that it has. So basically, it focuses a lot on how to include women needs and people with some disabilities to be part of the transportation system without problem and taking into account their special needs or requirement. And more than that, this project is a really flagship project because also generate a movement in the region to change the transportation system for all other countries. In that regard, so far, this has been the motivation and motivation for other countries to start developing some kind of projects in the transportation sector, such as train, electric buses for public transportation, but also for private transportation. And which is important here to say is that this will change the way that the Central American region will move in the future. And this will help a lot to the integration, but also to the economy, because our countries rely a lot on fuel. And then if fuel goes up, so all the economy suffer. But then if we rely less in the economy, in the fuels, so then the economy will be more competitive and less impacted by the fuel cost. So this is very important for that. And coming to the future, we as KBA, we use this example as a big example for coming with new projects in the region. And in that regard, we realized that there is a lot of issues regarding project preparation, for instance. So there are a lot of problems with this. So in that regard, we also set up a project preparation facility to support the development of these new projects. And this will also leverage the possibility to get additional financing. And not only financing for us, but also continue supporting or the countries to get financing from GCF and other partners. But also we are being very active in the ESG bond market issuance in order to channel additional resources that will help us to contribute to the economic and social development of Central American countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. A very, very important point you made. Latin America region is one of the highest region for personal vehicle growth. So this is a very important project for energy transition. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Mr. Jorems Craven, Director from FMO. The role of FMO and equity specifically in energy transition. Over to you, please.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I'm very happy to be able to be here today and talk about all the projects that we do at GCF. We have a slight logistical challenge because I think all the things we do together and we're still discussing, it's going to take about 20 minutes to talk about. Now, don't worry. I will limit myself to only one project, one example, and it's the most recent one we did together, which is indeed an equity project, and it's the Green Growth Equity Fund that we financed together. It's managed by Eversource in India. It's a very exciting one. So they're actually financing across the energy space, from e-mobility, resource efficiency, also waste to energy. They're doing energy services as well as more classic renewable energy projects as well. I think innovative in the structure is that GCF is actually financing it with 132.5 million of first loss equity, plus another 30 from FMO. And as we've heard about today, first loss and concessional funding is very important to scale. So in this case, actually, that is mobilizing an additional almost 400 million in capital, which I think is a great success. And I think this collaboration is important because we're through the equity structure actually, and the sub-delegation, of course, via FMO, engaging a very capable local partner with knowledge and execution capability. And I think that helps us to deliver very innovative solutions on the ground. One example, and I think that's the other reason why we need concessional capital, because it allows you to take more risk. And certainly in the equity space, it allows you then to come up with some new ideas and experiments. So a nice example of that in the Indian context is green cell mobility. So they're actually piloting an idea where they're going to deliver transportation services. So they have a lot of vehicles that they're now trying to offer as a service, both to businesses, government, and also consumers. And I think these structures help you innovate in those ways. And because I'm the last speaker, I'm going to keep it very short and crisp and stop here.
Thank you, Jerome. Really appreciate that. The event doesn't end without a celebration. We have, I'm joined, great pleasure in introducing Henry Gonzalez, our director for the private sector facility. I'm joined by him here. We will have a short signing ceremony, the Green Growth Equity Fund that Jerome talked about. We are signing that today and making it operational. So very, very glad that we're doing that. And we're very glad that we have some of our government's representatives here. So I call upon Henry and Jerome to sign this, and then we will have a picture of all of that, and a few words from Henry after that.
Really excited about that.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you very much, Kavita, and I'd like to thank all the speakers from the government and also our partners, because this is exactly what we call blended finance, is how do we work with a country ownership approach, and how do we try to be innovative working with financial partners like FMO. This is, I would say, one of those almost records of a fund that we only approved in May, and today we're signing or have a symbolized ceremony of the execution. Means that now we can start the disbursements and the funding. And this is important because it's India's first sort of climate fund of its kind, and at the same time, is a fund that with 132.5 million, hopefully will almost leverage $1 billion. And it's also a fund that has a technical assistance window, but a small one, meaning that you would focus on those areas that are the most needed. So in GCF, we have the approval that the board does for a funding proposal, and the next step is to negotiate the funded agreement, and that's what we have here today. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to hand over the signed executed copy as a symbol of this celebratory opportunity of one of those innovations that we're doing in private equity with FMO. And then after that, we're going to present a small video that explains the scope of this fund and explains how this is somehow helping India achieve its climate action and climate ambitions. So allow me to just transfer to you in very good hands the signed executed copy for you to take over to The Hague. And I'd like to shake hands as a representation of our partnership and looking forward to the next projects that we have. As he said, with FMO, we have a strong partnership and a partnership also of a lot of innovation. So with this, if we could have the video of this fund, just to provide you a small recap, and then I'll pass it on to Kavita for the closure. Thank you so much. Thank you. We're having the video coming soon.
decarbonise the sectors of renewable energy, e-mobility, water and waste. We approved over $130 million to support this important initiative.
Thank you, Kavita. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists, Miguel, Abdul Sakela, Sharim, Henry. Thank you all from the government representation here for joining us today on discussion on energy transition, supporting the aspirations and ambitions of developing country. The task is big, but it's not something that cannot be overcome with partnerships and alliances. We're very, very glad that you were here to join us today. Thank you so very much. We end this session here now. Thank you.